Sam Turner, who's Professor of Archaeology and Director of the McCourt Centre for Landscape at Newcastle University. And Sam's work focuses on historic landscapes and early medieval archaeology in Europe. And then next we have Dr. Tim Kinnaird, who's a geoscientist who directs the Luminescence Lab at the School of Earth and Environmental Sciences at the University of St. Andrews, and who's an expert in luminescence dating. And I had the pleasure of working with both of them for my own Marie Curie project 2 years ago, investigating the age of field systems in the UK. But today they are here to talk about some of the fascinating research they've been doing in the Mediterranean, investigating the history of terraced landscapes. And so Sam, I'd like to give the floor over to you.
Thank you. Thank you very much, Sutkin. Don't worry, you will see yourself in the slides.
Sorry, could I just ask the people who are not speaking to maybe turn their cameras off now? Thank you.
Okay, so I'll start to share the screen. Can you see that okay?
Yeah.
Great. Okay. So, thanks very much indeed for inviting Tim and I to talk to your seminar this afternoon. It's a real pleasure to be able to describe some of the work that we've been doing in the Mediterranean, a series of pilot studies looking at terraces and their dating. And I'll be talking about how we came to do this work and describe some of the pilot studies to you and the results that we've obtained so far. And then just very briefly reflect on what this might mean for future work and tell you about our research plan. Before we do that, we should acknowledge and thank the co-authors who have contributed to the specific results that I'm presenting to you this afternoon. And here they are. And in fact, the paper which this talk is based on will soon be published in Antiquity. So if you wish to read it there, actually you can read the preprint already via my webpage at the university. But these people have all contributed in different ways to this research. And in fact, there are even more people who are acknowledged on the final slide. So it's a team effort, not individual research. But today you only have Tim and I as representatives of this team. So I'll start by explaining what the problem was and how we came across this problem and why we thought we needed to try and address it. So we first came across the issue of terraces and their dating when I was working on a small project more than 10 years ago on the island of Naxos. We've continued to work on Naxos, and I'll show you some more results from there later on in the talk. But this was our first attempt to understand the historic landscape of Naxos. And in fact, the project was mainly based on remote sensing rather than fieldwork. And the problem was this. Naxos has a fantastic, diverse, rich historic landscape with thousands of historic features surviving in that landscape. And you can see on the plan, on the screen, some of those historic features mapped. The red lines represent dry stone walls, and the green lines represent terraces, agricultural terraces. And you can see some of those in the photograph. Naxos is quite, as you can see, quite unusual for an Aegean island in that, especially in the center of the island, there's a reasonable amount of water, rainfall, and there are some quite substantial trees, including these oak trees and olives. It's quite green on the inside of the island. And you can see those trees growing on terraces in that photograph. Now, We were interested because we were trying to understand the historic landscape and the processes through which it had been created. We were interested to try to understand the date of the terraces. How old were the terraces? Because this was a crucial issue in understanding how that landscape had evolved over the last, well, who knows? We don't know how old the terraces were. So the key challenge, one of the key challenges was that we weren't able to find any research which had established the date of these terraces. There had been some work done by a Swiss researcher in the 1980s, which had suggested that the terraces could be as old as the medieval period, but the general consensus was that that was rather optimistic in terms of dating, and that they were probably more recent, but nobody really knew how old. However, we did have a few indications that they might be quite old features, including based on the relative position of other monuments. So the image, the building in the image is a church. This is the church of Agios Isidoros, St. Isidore. And the structure you can see is largely a 7th century building. Naxos is really unusual anywhere in the world, but it's really unusual in that it has a very large number of standing early medieval churches built between about the 7th century and the 10th or 11th century. And nobody really knows exactly how many, but certainly more than 50, maybe over 100 buildings of that period surviving on the island. And this one appears to stand on one of these terraces. And of course, if the church is built on one of these terraces, it suggests the terrace is older than the church, and that the terrace therefore may have been constructed in late antiquity or even earlier in the Roman or classical periods. But this is based on the relative dating rather than absolute dating. And Naxos is absolutely covered in terraces. They're on this one island, which is around 40 kilometers long and 30 kilometers wide. We have tens of thousands of kilometers of terraces surviving. The photograph on the screen is from 1943, and it was taken by the Royal Air Force during the war. And it shows the terraces as they are surviving on the landscape. You can see them here. And if you compare this photograph with the modern landscape, you would see that it's almost exactly the same today. So that the preservation of those historic terrace features since 80 years ago has been really quite good. There's good preservation of these features. So how can we work out how old they were? Well, we tried sort of standard landscape or archaeological or historical geography methods, such as retrogressive analysis, and that gave us some clues as to the date of these features. So in this diagram, you can see that the red lines, which are the dry stone walls, are very commonly lying over the green lines, which are the terraces. You can see that here, or you can see it over here on the west side, or down here in the south. And this actually is an extremely common situation on the island of Naxos. We have these dry stone walls, which almost everywhere are built over the terraces, across the terraces. And what that suggests strongly is that the dry stone walls are all newer than the terraces. We think that the dry stone walls date to the 18th or maybe early 19th century in the majority. And that suggests that the terraces are older than that. It gives us a relative dating. But of course, that only tells us a little bit really about the history of the terraces, because we don't know how much older they might be. So this is our problem that we were faced with, and for which we could not find a good solution. Well, a little bit later on, I was involved in this project, Pahis Cat, which is a project on the historic landscape of Catalonia, led by Jordi Bolos, who is a professor of medieval history in the University of Lleida in Catalonia. And that project was designed to create a landscape characterization methodology which could be used in Catalonia to inform planning, and especially the landscape catalogues of Catalonia, to help understand the historic dimension of the landscape in a broad way. And it produced maps which look like this. This is a characterization maps which attempts to synthesize the historic development of this landscape and map the landscape character of different areas. And Catalonia also is very rich in terraces, and we realized that there too we had the same problem. So we didn't really know exactly how old the terraces were. We were able in places to devise a relative chronology for aspects of the landscape, but it still left the dating floating. So, for example, this is a place called Vilalta, and here we were able to identify several different types of terraces. So you can see in dark green the braided terraces, and in yellow what we call the terraced fields. But we weren't able exactly to assign dates when these features were likely to have been constructed. How old are these fields and these terraces? This is the key issue. And it's a key question in understanding the history of Mediterranean landscapes, but not actually only Mediterranean landscapes. In fact, terrace features can be found really all over the world. On most continents of the world, there are terraces which are UNESCO World Heritage Landscapes, for example, from South America to the far east of Asia. So in Catalonia, we knew that some of the terraces could date to at least as early as the early Middle Ages, based on documentary references to field systems around settlements, like this place, Sant Julià de Cerdanyola, which has some fantastic Carolingian documentary sources referring to the field system there. And you can see the extensive terrace system in this valley, but also on the mountain sides around, now unused terraces. So we have possible documentary references, but again, these don't really help us, apart from identifying that there were fields in a particular place or terraces in a particular area. They don't tell us if they were these terraces that we're looking at, or how long they had been there when they were recorded in these documents. So what about archaeological methods for dating terraces? There are various techniques that archaeologists have tried to use, but it has proved to be quite a difficult problem. Perhaps the most obvious technique, the first technique that people have used, is to try to date terraces based on the artifacts which occur in the soil that makes up the terrace. But this has a number of problems associated with it. Very, very occasionally, we have so many artifacts of a similar date occurring within soils in terraces that archaeologists have felt confident about assigning a date to their construction, and that's the case in the example with the photographs on the screen. This is from a paper by Koborov and Borisov in Antiquity for 2013. And in this case study, there's so much pottery appearing in these terraces from certain periods that they were confident in assigning a date to them. But that is a very, very unusual example. In fact, normally, even in the Mediterranean, where ceramics are everywhere, when we excavate a section through a terrace, we find artifacts are either not present at all, or are there in such tiny abraded fragments that it's really impossible to date the terrace construction based on the presence of those ceramics. Not least because it's almost impossible to say whether they are deposited in a primary context or whether they've been redeposited from somewhere else. And this issue of deposition and redeposition is a real problem for all the previously used archaeological methods which have attempted to date terraces, including also the scientific methods. So obviously excavation on a large scale just to date terraces is a high cost methodology, but it's still, even detailed excavation can't really help with these problems where we don't have suitable material to date and it's hard to identify and fragmentary appearing in the soils. Well, other techniques have been attempted as well. For example, the use of radiocarbon dating. And there have been some really interesting studies of that, especially, for example, from Galicia in northwest Spain, like the example on the screen, where in this case, a very large terrace was excavated and bulk sediment samples were dated to processed to date the carbon fraction in the bulk sediment in the soil. And that produced results, but recent studies have shown that dating the carbon fraction in environmental samples like terraces tends to give an overestimate of the age of the soil because of the material which is already present in the environment. But also, we have the problem that if we're only dating one or possibly two bulk sediment samples from a terrace, it's very difficult, impossible in fact, to allow for the possibility that soils may have been redeposited in that terrace or that there may have been other types of disturbance. A third method that's been used to try to date terraces is OSL dating, optically stimulated luminescence dating. And OSL dating is a technique which can provide a date for the last time that a sample, the sediment within a sample, was exposed to light. So the time when that sample was buried. So there are various minerals which occur in sediments naturally, specifically quartzes and feldspars and also some other minerals, which from the time that they are buried in darkness start to trap naturally occurring radiation at a predictable speed. And if we can measure the amount of naturally occurring radiation in the environment, and we can measure the amount of radiation stored in the sample, we can calculate the time when that sample was buried. Because when the sample is exposed to light again, it releases that naturally occurring radiation. And we can do that using instruments in lab conditions and count the amount of radiation and thereby calculate the time when it was buried. So this is a useful methodology. But if we're just dating individual OSL samples of sediments, we have the same problems, some of the same problems that we have with radiocarbon dating and with artifact dating. So that's to say, we can't be sure whether the part of the soil profile that we're dating has been redeposited, whether it's in a primary or a secondary context. And we also can't be sure whether we are choosing to date the right part of that profile to understand the date of construction, because we're essentially trying to target blind which part of the profile to collect material for dating from without really knowing how old the material above or below it is. And that can be highly problematic. OSL dating can also be relatively expensive, especially if we're trying to date several samples from one profile. So these are some of the problems which faced the existing methods for dating earthwork features, not just terraces, of course, but all kinds of earthwork features like ditches and banks and other types of features. Well, a possible solution to this problem arose when I met Tim Kinnaird, who will speak in a moment. There's Tim in, I guess that's in the early 2000s, Tim, and you're in a canoe in the Arctic undertaking geological survey. But the solution involved the instrument that you can see bottom left on the screen, and that is a portable optically stimulated luminescence reader, a portable OSL reader that had been developed by David Sanderson and his colleagues at SUAG in Glasgow, in Scotland, where Tim was working at the time. And I was originally in touch with Tim because we were just having some conventional OSL dates taken from an archaeological site that we were working on. And the topic of Mediterranean terraces and the difficulty of dating them came up in conversation. And Tim and David suggested that using this instrument might help us in addressing that issue. Tim, shall I hand over to you and you can explain how the instrument can be used?
Sure. Do you have that? Is this my slide up next?
Yes.
Yeah, that's handy then.
Do you want it now?
Yeah, that's great. So this is what luminescence looks like in the field. So if you look at the graphs on the left, the important points is the bottom axis, that's time, and the vertical axis, that's luminescence. So as Sam explained, what we're interested in is the amount of luminescence that grows in situ. So the longer a sediment sample has been buried, the longer that luminescence will grow. Yeah, so the two graphs then highlight a young sample, which has a small amount of luminescence. It's not been buried for very long, so it's not had long for that to receive a radiation dose. Whereas the graphs below that, no, my cursor won't work. That's the old sediment, and you can see that's got a lot more luminescence within it. So what we can do is we can look at the size of that peak for a spot sample, and that gives us a relative control on how much luminescence is within the sediment. So we don't take a single reading. We look at IRSL, so that's a response mostly from feldspars. We look at OSL, and that's a response from quartz. So you can't tell because of the scale it's plotted at, but there's two peaks in there, so there's two different dating signals to look at. And the ratio of those two peaks tells us something about the minerals that are contained within the soil. So another thing to point out is it's on that graph is the time. It takes 160 seconds per measurement. So this is a rapid technique. Yeah, so that's the luminescence from a single sample, which is all great. You learn a lot. But imagine then if you had a whole profile through an entire sedimentary sequence, as Sam's highlighting now, we can start to compare and contrast the luminescence from the top at the bottom. So there's a relative chronology. Then we can start to look at the gradients through that graph, just to the left of the cursor there. And that tells us whether the sediment's been deposited slowly, if it's been redeposited, if it's been dumped. So we can start to form hypotheses on how that soil has developed through time. And then in relation to the terrace walls, if they were cut into that sediment face behind that, and then look at how the luminescence in that soil varies, how it varies underneath the wall, we can compare and contrast. We might be able to identify the horizons that were bleached at construction, as Sam's highlighting just now. And because that was bleached, it removes the OSL, it's buried, and then starts to accumulate a signal again there, which is why, that sits to the left of our plot. Everything to the right is residual, it's been buried for longer, whereas the sample that's been reset at construction has a lower luminescence, and that's what we target for dating. So this is important. It means that we can go into the sedimentary sequences, we can look at the sedimentology, we can look at the archaeology, we can relate the two, and we can say for certain that if we were to put an OSL sample in for dating at that point, we'd have a date on construction. Yeah, so if I hand back to Sam, do you have some more examples?
Thanks, Tim. Do you want to talk through these ones? And I can point
so this is just to show various scenarios we could have in the field and how the luminescence might vary. So the three samples we have are on the left of the screen. That's when there's been a cut and then a terrace wall placed in front of it. The second example, so in the middle then, that's when they've constructed a wall and they've allowed the soil to accumulate behind that naturally. And then the third is a combination of them both. And then in the little hypothetical plots we have on the upper row, that's how the luminescence might look in the field. So on the left hand, that's the example I've already explained. On the right hand side, if you look at the luminescence plots there, you can see there's gradients in the data, and that tells us something about how fast that sediment was accumulating. Yeah, which is important because then we can start talking about construction, as we have the horizon that was bleached beneath the wall. But then we can start to talk about how that terrace was used in its lifetime as well. So because we have a chronology for the whole sequence. So that's all we can do in the field, and we use this tool to identify where we want to date, to put dating samples in. The next thing we do is we bring those samples back to the lab and we look at those. And in this case, we calibrate those signals. Yeah, and that's what the bottom plots are, where it's got stage 3. They're all examples whereby we've taken the same profile that we had at the top, we've brought it back, we've extracted quartz, and we've calibrated it. So now we have the luminescence in terms of an apparent dose, and that's our proxy for age. We use this to construct our chronologies, but we also use it to decide whether we want to take a sample forward to dating or not. Because there's expense in dating, we want to do it targeted. So that's why there's an example 1 and 2 here. We had the example where it's worked perfectly. We can see the stratigraphic trends. We can see the horizon that's been reset. So we can date all of those events in the sequence of the soil. On the right-hand side, you're not seeing those trends. And we know we could date the sample, but it'd be likely to give us an over-aged estimation, which would be no use to us. So in that case, we wouldn't take that sample forward to dating. And then the other examples there you have in the middle and the right are just other hypotheses where we're testing the data. And you can see how, again, we're looking for the gradients, the stratigraphic progressions in the data that inform on process.
Great. Thanks, Tim.
No worries.
No, I'm just being incompetent with my pointer here. Right, that's good. Okay. So also this illustrates 2 of the stages in the process. What we've got here is stage 2, the field profiling, and what we have is stage 3, the lab profiling. So we collect in parallel 2 lots of samples, one for testing in the field, which then enables us also to collect a sample for possible OSL dating, and a second lot of samples which we process in the lab. And that enables us to check the behavior of the sediments that we observed in the field, to double check, and also to see whether those samples are likely to be yield a useful result from full OSL dating. Okay, so here is an example, and I've shown you this one. We're showing you this one because Sitkin was involved in this work. This was work that we did as part of our contribution to Sitkin's postdoctoral project on ancient field systems in Britain. So we're in Britain still, not yet in the Mediterranean, I'm afraid. This is Zena in Cornwall, in the far southwest of England, and it's a famous example of possible prehistoric field systems, which had been surveyed by landscape archaeologists, but had never been formally dated. So they believed that they had here field systems whose origins were in the Bronze Age. That's these coaxial field systems in this area. In the Iron Age, that's these so-called regular field systems here. And also in the Middle Ages, that's some of the strip field systems, which are not marked separately on the diagram. So our research question was to try to investigate this issue and see if we could use this technique to get dates, because these features, these boundary features you can see, are all constructed from earth banks and should therefore be suitable for testing with this method. So as you can look, operating the portable OSL instrument in the field, And there's Tim, and I think that's Niels Stabout there. Hello, Niels. Undertaking some work excavating a small section through one of these features. This is this feature number 1 on what should be, according to the surveyors, a Bronze Age field, the boundary of a Bronze Age field system. And indeed, this is the section through that bank, and you can see here the different process, the different stages. So this is the field profiling, looking at the intensity of the signals. This is the lab profiling, and finally, we have the OSL dates from the dating samples, which we positioned in the field thanks to the information we were getting from the field profiling. And indeed, it turned out that this bank, you can see the stony, rubbly core of the bank. This is the 2 sides of the section. Was dated to the Middle Bronze Age period. So that was very interesting because this was one of the very first examples of a Bronze Age boundary that had been dated directly dated by scientific dating on the construction of the feature. Also, there were what were thought to be Iron Age boundary banks at the site. So we targeted one of those. This is a section through that big earth bank you can see here with stones in its makeup and mostly made up of earth, of sediment. And so what we took here was a series of profiles through the makeup of that bank material with field profiling here, and then with lab profiling. And finally, OSL dating. And the diagram here shows you the apparent dose, apparent radiation stored dose, which we derive from the profiling samples. And then we're able to calibrate that in using these OSL dates. And what this showed us was that we have here a naturally occurring and Bronze Age soil. That's in the warmer colors, the red at the base. And this stone bank was cut into that and sediment built up behind it during the Iron Age and the Roman period. And then something happened in the late Roman period, or the very beginning of the early medieval period. The farming system apparently changed, and that bank began to, that small, low, stony bank began to grow into this large earth bank, which is there today. And that was a progressive process lasting from around about the beginning of the 7th century through to at least the 13th, 14th century. And then a small stone wall was built on top of it in the post-medieval period. So using this technique, what we were able to see was the whole history of the development and growth of this structure, this field boundary within this field system. And Tim has recently applied the same method to the terraces which occur on the side of Arthur's Seat in the centre of Edinburgh. This is the remains of the extinct volcano in the centre of Edinburgh. And we've got this representation of the apparent dose, again using the same method or a similar method, and you can see the profiling samples through here. And what this interestingly is able to show, we've got the archaeological context numbers written on here, but this is able to show that we've got redeposition of sediment in parts of this profile. So this illustrates how we can observe how sediment moves about on in this soil profile. Tim, I don't know if you want to comment on that further.
Yeah, it's just as Sam says. So the question we had here was whether these are prehistoric features or medieval, and there's been no constraints on the age of these cultivation terraces in the centre of Edinburgh before. So because you can see these footpaths that are coming up towards the summit, they're destroying the archaeology, so we had permission to go in and excavate. So we're quite lucky. So we were able to cut across 4 of these cultivation terraces. And yeah, the point to make is by looking at multiple profiles through a single section, we can start to talk about the chronology across the whole of that soil profile. And as Sam picks out, you can see that that top layer there has all been deposited on top of a younger unit. So yeah, we can start to talk about the chronology and how this is a turf bank that formed one of these cultivations, how that's grown with time. So when we get our dates back from at the base, so just above that red unit, and then at the top at the blue, we'll have a chronology for that whole sequence and how that turf bank's developed with time.
Great. Thanks very much, Tim. So hopefully that illustrates to you how this methodology can be used. And when we were first looking at this, one of the first sites that I was involved in using this on, the first projects, was this project in Catalonia with Jordi Bolos, coming out of the País Cat project. This is one was called Canvis y Continuitats, changes and continuities. And its aim was to try to investigate, again, the historic landscape character of some parts of Catalonia, and to inform that using this method to try to date some of the terraces. And you can see here, there's Tim sampling from the face of this earth terrace, and this is my colleague Alex Turner, who's just laser scanning the site to get a 3D record of the location of the samples. And here on the right, this is a landscape characterization, historic landscape characterization that we produced after the work there. So this is the field, one of the field boundaries at Vilalta, which is the site I showed you before with the yellow terraced fields on the diagram. And you can see these fantastic rough ashlar faced terraces, which are totally typical of this part of Catalonia, central Catalonia. And this is our team sampling in a place where the wall had collapsed. So we're trying to create a minimal amount of damage by sampling where the wall is already damaged. And this method actually is relatively non-intrusive. Of course, it does involve a small amount of removal of material, so we can access samples which have been in the dark, buried behind the terrace wall, but it's relatively non-intrusive. So we've sampled this site here, and we've collected profiles, a series of profiles through this feature. And the result was that we had a good series of profiles, and we're able to date the construction of these terraced fields to around the year 1200. And that was a surprise, because firstly, we didn't know if this method would work when we were doing this, and it turned out that it did work well, but also we weren't expecting these fields, these terraced fields, to be quite that early, although it does make sense. This is the site that we sampled here. This is the village of Vilalta, and the church at Vilalta was built in the middle of the 12th century. And so it's possible that this whole landscape that we can see here was largely laid out or reorientated with the village and the field systems around it in and around the 12th century. So that was rather interesting for us, and helped us to develop our method into a series of 5 steps. And we've seen those different steps as we've explained the methodology. We've got the first step, when we do an initial review of the landscape, initial characterization to identify likely sites and to target specific sites in the field. Then we've got the second stage, which is the field profiling, when we take those first lot of samples, process them in the field, and take our OSL dating samples using the information we get here. Then we've got the OSL lab profiling to refine our profiles and to ensure that we're taking forward useful samples to OSL dating. Fourthly, we have the formal OSL dating of individual samples, which gives us the actual absolute dates when we can identify that the material was deposited, which we can then use to tie into the profiles, the OSL profiling data from the previous 2 stages. And then finally, we can feed that information forward into our landscape characterization to help us understand both the construction of the individual terraces that we've been working on, and potentially, by analogy, use that to inform our understanding of features with a similar morphology in the surrounding area. So we've got a 5-step process which is designed to date individual features, but also to give us broader information about the landscape history of a particular area. In order to test this methodology, we've now applied it in 5 case study areas, 2 in Turkey, 2 in Spain, and 1 in Greece. And what I'm going to do is just run through some of those results. I'm not going to go through all of the results in any detail because there's quite a lot, but we'll synthesize them for you at the end to give a sense of the overall results from the project so far. I'm going to start in the easternmost area that you can see on the screen, the Göksu Valley on the south coast of Turkey. So these are some terraces at a place called Gölcük, which is just inland, just behind the coast, a couple of kilometers in the foothills of the Taurus Mountains. And you can see the character of these terraces. They're rather narrow, quite dilapidated, although in places still cultivated. But a lot of collapse and a lot of movement of sediment here. So when we arrived in this field, we thought it looked rather unpromising to get any good results, although we could see that there were areas where sediment profiles were preserved. This was a project in collaboration with our colleague Günde Varenliolu from Mimar Sinan University in Istanbul. Günde runs a project called the Bozak Archaeology Project, focused on an island just off the coast here, but with a large area of hinterland behind, where we were able to undertake some of this terrace dating work. Well, it turned out that we were able to get dates from the terraces at Gölcük. And interestingly, they were a similar date to the ones that we got over in Catalonia, dating to around the end of the 12th century, at least in this example here. The terraces there were constructed with a range of dates, but significant number of them dating to the later medieval period, to the 12th and the early 13th century, with some constructed later and some constructed earlier. You can see there's a good progression of age with depth, so we can be reasonably confident when we date this sample, OSL dating sample here, about the steady buildup of sediment above that sample in the terrace. Now, that date of the later Middle Ages was a bit of a surprise for us at Gölcük. And you can see here, these are the profiles that we sampled here at Gölcük. You can see these are the surviving terraces in green. But this area in black marks the extent of a large late antique settlement with surviving standing ruins of houses, and several churches, various other types of buildings. So you can see that that extends over several hundred meters there. And so we were reasonably expecting that the terraces adjacent to that large, now deserted settlement would be of a similar kind of date. But in fact, they weren't. They were dating to the later Middle Ages, when otherwise we had really relatively little evidence for activity in this landscape in the later medieval period. For example, there's very little documentary evidence and very little in the way of surface ceramics, which had been collected from this area, indicating late medieval activity. So interestingly, our work on the terraces complemented other types of archaeological survey, which showed there was late antique activity by showing that there was also previously really unsuspected late medieval activity. This is another example from the same study, and in this area at Gecerim, we could show that these terraces had been used from the late Roman period, from the 4th and 5th century, right through with construction of more terraces in the later Middle Ages, up until the early 19th century, the latest terraces that we were able to identify constructed in this area, with episodes of construction and use of those terraces throughout that period. Okay, the next example that we'll look at very briefly is here on Naxos, which is where we started out trying to tackle this issue. And subsequently, I've been involved in this project, the Apaliru Environs project on Naxos, focused on this early and middle Byzantine castle at Castra Apaliru, which is a large fortified settlement, but surveying the area of the landscape around. And of course, as we saw before, Naxos is a historic terraced landscape. Here's our field team collecting ceramic shards and other objects during field survey, but we don't know how old those terraces are, how long those terraces have stood in the shadow of the castro on the top of the mountain at Castra Apaliru. Well, our field walking, of course, is using a relatively standard methodology of collecting ceramics, analyzing their distribution, and trying to understand their significance in terms of historic development of settlement patterns, and also using other methods like standing buildings analysis. So you can see there's a church there, the Church of Aios Stephanos, which is in the plain of Marathos, just south of the castle on the mountain. And for example, here we've been able to show that settlement around this church developed from late antiquity and continued through into the Middle Byzantine period and later. One of the key types of evidence here are amphorae like these, and these have shown quite clearly that we've got significant areas of settlement on this mountain, in this mountain landscape, in the early Middle Ages. So between the 7th and the 10th or 11th centuries, we've got quite extensive areas of settlement identified from the ceramics that we've been able to recover, but also from the survey of standing remains. So my colleagues from the University of Oslo, led by Knut Ødegaard, have surveyed the fortress on the mountaintop, and my colleagues from the University of Edinburgh, led by Jim Crow, have surveyed the settlement below on the mountainside, where they've recorded over 100 buildings dating from that early medieval period. So here we were interested again to try and understand the date of terraces which lie across this landscape, and particularly in a small valley which runs down to the west and south of the settlement area here. And so Tim came out to work with us on Naxos in 2016, and we were able to sample a whole series of the terraces in this valley in order that we could try to identify whether we've got terraces operating over a long period and whether they belong to the same period that the castle and the settlement around it were inhabited. Well, we had good results from the survey with the age depth progression that we might expect to find. But once again, we were relatively surprised to see that the construction of these terraces was mostly in the late Middle Ages and episodes of reconstruction in the early modern period. And that was really interesting because from the ceramic survey of that settlement, the lower settlement area, we did not have significant amounts of late medieval ceramics. So we weren't expecting to see an intensive late medieval exploitation of the landscape, but that's clearly what's shown in the OSL data. A final example across at Samos in northwest Spain, in Galicia. This is a famous monastery where a project is being led by our colleague Jose Carlos Sanchez Pardo from University of Santiago de Compostela. And here around the monastery, we know that the landscape is, from documentary sources, that the landscape has been exploited since at least the 8th century, and various types of investigation have taken place, including OSL profiling and dating on terrace features. Here you can see us in some woodland. And here also we work with Noemi Silva Sanchez, who is a paleoenvironmentalist, to sample in parallel for OSL profiling and dating and for paleoenvironmental pollen samples, to compare and correlate the results from those two techniques. And here we were able to show, for example, that various terraces were created or recreated in the 17th century, a period where we knew there would be significant activity because we have it documented in a series of documents, but also in the 12th and 13th century, and probably in the 8th century, when the monastery was, just after the monastery was founded and was really kind of transforming this landscape. So just to summarize then the results that we've had so far, we have 52 profiles through terraces, which are made up of just over an average of 10 profiling samples each, 528 field samples, translating into 357 lab samples, and 65 OSL dates from those 52 profiles. Those are in our study areas. The other circles on this diagram represent other projects where radiocarbon dates have been published for the date of terrace construction and use. Well, the diagram you can see now summarizes the results from our project for the construction or major reconstruction of terraces in each of our study areas. And interestingly, you can see that there's a real, seems to be a real intensification in the construction of terraces in the late medieval period. So just after the year 1000, and indeed also, particularly in some areas, Galicia and Catalonia, in the early modern period as well. And if we turn those results into a graph, this is what they look like. So the top graph shows you the sediment ages, that's the OSL date ages for construction of those terraces. And you can see they're in the late medieval period and the early modern period principally. And the graph in the middle, that shows us sediment ages for the use of the terraces. And as we might expect, we can see that there is a progressive increase in the number of those dates up until the 19th century. So we've got more or less continuous use of the terraces, but because we've got a big increase in their construction in the late medieval period, then we've got a peak in use in the early modern period. I mean, I should point out that we do see construction of terraces in the classical period, the Roman period, and through the early Middle Ages, and you can see that represented in these diagrams. So terraces are not an innovation of the late medieval period, but their construction seems to intensify in that period, and then their use continues throughout. The bottom diagram shows you radiocarbon ages for utilization, and they tend to focus on a slightly earlier period than our dates do. So this is made up of 55 OSL dates, 228 apparent ages, that's from the profiling data, and the 42 radiocarbon ages that have been collected from the literature. So the results, to summarize, show there's a significant construction of terrace systems in our study areas across the whole of this region, the whole of this Southern European and Mediterranean region, between about 1100 and 1600. And that the OSL profiles suggest that there's continuous use of these terrace systems, more or less continuous use, with significant episodes of refurbishment, which we can identify in the data. So that was really interesting for us to see those results, and we think they're useful results. But we realized that actually these data are potentially useful in a number of ways for further applications, because we can now reasonably accurately date the construction and the use of earthworks like terraces. That gives us the opportunity to tie those dates into other types of analyses. So, for example, geochemical analyses or plant fossil analyses of the soil. And that means that we have really, I think for the first time, the opportunity to write landscape history directly from the soil itself, well-dated landscape history from the soil, without relying on having to have documentary sources or other types of archaeological data. And also what that could enable us to do is to understand long-term change, to help us to inform strategies for sustainable landscape management. We may be able to understand better what strategies have been sustainable in past landscapes and in particular areas, and use that knowledge to help us to inform the strategies that people might use to manage landscapes in the future. And one of the ways, for example, that we're trying to do that is through the project that we did with Gunde, that's Gunde Varanliolu, peering into the future through her binoculars. This is a landscape characterization, which we've used as the basis for forward modeling what landscapes in the future might look like if they change in particular ways and at particular rates. And if we can better understand how they've changed in the past, that might help us to better understand how they might change in the future. So in order to try and help us address these issues, we've recently embarked on a new project, which is called Terraces, or Terraces as Sustainable Agricultural Environments. And that is a partnership between Tim and I, my colleague Lisa Shillito at Newcastle University, and also the University of Granada in Andalusia, and several other partner organizations in Spain, Greece, and Croatia. And through our case studies there, what we hope to do is to date a whole series of terraces to analyze the sediment records for other proxies, so for pollen, for plant macrofossils, for geochemistry, for soil micromorphology, to understand how those sediments have been used. And to use that information to help us model aspects of landscape change, such as soil erosion, for example, in the future. We started in 2020, last year, but our fieldwork was severely curtailed by the impact of the coronavirus epidemic. So we have yet really to get going with our project in terms of fieldwork and lab analyses, but we ardently hope that we'll be able to start doing that work in earnest from this year, from 2021. And we hope that this can be one of the ways that archaeology can contribute not only to understanding past landscapes, understanding the history of past landscapes, but also to understanding some of the challenges that face the people who live in and work in and use and rely on these landscapes today. One of the ways that archaeologists might address some of the challenges laid out in the UN's Sustainable Development Goals, of which so many there are so many which archaeologists can address, can contribute to through their work. So we hope that our project will be able to make a contribution looking forwards, as well as a contribution looking back to the past. Well, that brings us pretty much to the end of our talk. All that remains for us to say is to say thank you to you for listening, and thank you to our collaborators and to the funding bodies who have supported this research so far. So thanks very much.
Thank you, Sam, and thanks, Tim, for your very exciting talk. I'm expecting that there will be some questions, so please go ahead if anyone has a question. I don't know, can we raise hands here? I don't know if I'll be able to see it, or otherwise you can just pop on your camera and your microphone. Or if there are no questions, then I will ask
have a
some.
question.
Yeah. Sorry, who was first? Was it, yeah, Ralph?
Okay, thank you very much, Sam. It was very inspiring and it's groundbreaking work, if you ask me. So congratulations. I had some questions on how do you select the terraces and how do you document them? Because you do a survey, it's mostly a large area, and then you want to select a few of those terraces. How do you do that?
Well, I mean, there's usually various practical constraints. So, you know, the number of examples that you actually can work on is often relatively limited in terms of access to land and land ownership and so on. So that's a boring kind of practical issue. More significantly, I think what we're looking for usually is a reasonably well-preserved sediment profile. So one of the things that archaeologists often focus on or concern themselves with is the actual appearance of the terrace wall. So that can be interesting, you know, but the issue with terrace walls or other kinds of walls facing earth features is that they are frequently can be rebuilt, reconstructed. So if you focus on that too much, you may actually be missing the more important information, which is the extent to which the sediment profile behind the terrace wall is well preserved. And so ideally what we need is a good depth of sediment with as little disturbance as possible. So, you know, normally you wouldn't choose to sample a profile which has got a big tree growing on it, or where we can see animal disturbance, or where we can see obvious signs of gullying or erosion. So we're looking for a reasonably well preserved sediment profile. If we can sample an area where we're going to cause relatively little destruction to existing archaeological features, you know, like the terrace wall, if it's already collapsed, then we might often try and sample in that area, so as to minimize the work of reconstruction, but also to minimize the disruption to the landscape. I suppose otherwise, you know, if we've got a large area, using a technique like characterization, we can identify different types of terraces within that area. And so we might choose to sample a series of different types of terraces in order to understand whether we've got terraces which are built and used at different times in that way.
Okay, but you use LiDAR or other things to document them, or?
Yeah, I mean, essentially, we'll use whatever data we can get our hands on. I mean, the data are not necessarily consistent across all areas. So yes, if LiDAR data is available, I mean, the whole of Spain has quite good and publicly accessible LiDAR data, for example. Some areas have good historic air photography, which is very useful. And in our current project, we're creating photogrammetric models based on historic air photography. Another source which we're just really starting to exploit for this is synthetic aperture radar data, SAR data. So we're lucky to have been awarded by the Italian Space Agency a series of tasking this year for new SAR data in our specific case studies, and that should enable us to create quite a detailed model of the surface of that terrain. I mean, otherwise, as you can see, we've also sometimes taken a terrestrial laser scanner into the field in order to create a 3D record of the area. If we can't do that for some reason, then we might use GPS or you know, other standard methods for recording the terrace systems.
Okay, thank you very much.
I was wondering about the dates. I was a bit surprised that they're so young, let's say, because I was familiar with terraces in Switzerland and South Italy, and they were dated much older. Of course, these dating were mostly radiocorbon or find dates. So is this a pattern you encounter often, that these terraces are meant to be older than they really are if you redate them with you more accurate methods? Or is it just a question of region and
yeah, I mean, not necessarily. I think that there are prehistoric terraces within our study area, and I mean, Tim has worked on the neighboring island of Naxos, Keros, where there are some prehistoric terraces, and so I mean, there are, from our data, there are prehistoric and ancient terraces. But they are relatively speaking, it appears they're relatively small in number. You know, we've got this significant intensification. That's what our data shows in the later medieval period. So I'm not saying that there aren't any prehistoric terraces or earlier terraces. Definitely there are some. It's just not as many as in the later period. And I suppose, you know, in a way that makes sense, because we might expect to see a gradual accretion, gradual addition of features in the landscape. It's just that in the late medieval period, there's seems to be a very significant intensification. Tim, do you want to comment on that?
No, it's just, yeah, I agree. We do have prehistoric terraces. The example I showed in Arthur's Seat, they're prehistoric. Keros, the island that Sam mentioned, they're prehistoric. So yeah, we will find them if we look.
Can I ask you? We have in Central Europe mostly terraces for producing of grain. Do you able distinguish in your sites? It was used for like orchard or like plowing field on top of the terraces, because it could influence soil profile in sense of stratigraphical integrity. We use for control of profile lead 210 to measure if soil is very young or 100 years, because it's limit of lead datation. Do you have some experience with distinguish of function of different arable terraces?
Yes, I understand. We haven't so far used lead 210 dating, although we could. I think it would be interesting to do that, to understand the recent history of the terraces and specifically also the recent history of sediment erosion on the terraces. So looking at the movement of sediment caused by recent agricultural activities. I mean, this is really one of the key issues that we hope to address in our current project, is more about the ways that the terraces were exploited historically. So not only in the last 100 years, but using the OSL profiling data to help us to understand how they were exploited, you know, throughout their lifetime, really. And we hope to do that. We hope to inform that with the soil geochemistry for looking at results, for example, from animal feces, potentially to look at different species which are using or grazing on the terraces, by looking at plant fossils, and by looking at other aspects of geochemistry and the soil micromorphology, to see if we can identify episodes of arable use or episodes when the terraces are only used for pasture, for example. So some of our terraces are irrigated terraces, so they again will have different types of use. And today, typically in several of these regions, we have polycropping. So we have arable and we have trees, olive trees or fruit or nut trees. And so those are also issues that we hope that we may be able to understand the longevity of those kinds of exploitations in our case study areas.
Thank you.
And in terms of modern ploughing, we can identify where that's occurred in the profiles by looking at the luminescent sequences. So in any one of the plots that Sam had in his PowerPoint, you can see where the top part is inverted. So we know not to sample from the top. So we can identify that and roll that out in the field.
I was wondering, oh, sorry, who was?
I can wait, it's okay.
Okay, I was just wondering, to follow up on the vegetation and use aspect, if you had any results from your combined OSL and pollen sampling yet, and what that shows.
Yeah, we did have some results, didn't we, Tim? I think we haven't published them yet.
Yeah.
You don't have to talk about them.
Oh, we're waiting on the results.
Oh, we're waiting for them still.
Yeah.
Okay, so we had some preliminary results, but now we're waiting on the final results. But
Exactly.
I think my understanding was that we will definitely get some results, which is good. So we'll definitely be able to relate the pollen data to the profiling data.
Yeah.
So that's another. What we've tried to do with various of these techniques is to try different additional proxies as we've done our small pilot studies in order to kind of work out whether we'll be able to use them in this bigger project. And so far we've had some quite good results with doing that.
Thanks. Lenka?
Okay. Thanks. I have a practical question concerning the sampling. As I understand, there are two ways. One of them, like using portable XRF, just pressing the equipment onto the wall and measure inside samples, or taking the samples out of the profile. Are you also using just pressing the equipment or some reader right on the section? If yes, then my question was if it doesn't influence the material around for the further OSL sampling.
Okay, that we have. Well, in fact, with Sietkin, we tried the method where we used parallel portable PXRF and portable OSL dating, but I think the way that we have sampled for the OSL dating involves removing small samples. So the small samples get removed and tested in the instrument on site under a dark cover. Whereas for that particular pilot study, the portable XRF dating was done on the samples in situ on the profile, but at the equivalent point, so close to where the OSL sample was taken. Not exactly the same location, but from the cleaned profile. So, Tim or Sietkin, do you have anything?
Yeah. So in luminescence dating, we need to take two measurements. One is the radioactivity of the soil, which I wouldn't routinely, well, I wouldn't do by XRF. We do it by gamma spectrometry, and that involves inserting a probe into the soil profile, and then that has to be left for 5 to 10 minutes to take its reading. So that's to do the radioactivity of the soil. The second measurement is the luminescence, and to do that, we clean the section, we then make it light safe by putting on a tarp, and then I'll go in and sample it, and then that sediment has to be removed and taken to the portable reader.
Okay, thank you. My question was if there is some coincidence between this online measurement and maybe the further OSL measurement, like if the portable measurement influenced by some kind the sediments that maybe the OSL samples taken later can give a little bit different age. I think I read some paper that XRF measurement can influence the sediment and the OSL data then show a little bit different age or something like this.
I don't know, but anyway, we would always do it the other way around. So sample for the OSL first and then do the XRF.
Okay, thank you.
I have a question. Thanks for your talk. I really enjoyed that. You mentioned a period of intensification. I wondered if you'd seen anything in the reverse, if there was a period of abandonment or if it's quite site specific.
I don't think we've got kind of marked period in the last 2,000 years when there are no terraces being constructed across these case study areas. So that they're pretty much the whole, apart from the last 100 years, or the last 150 years, let's say. So that would be the main period when there hasn't been construction of new terraces. So I think otherwise through the data, it looks like we've got kind of steady construction or reorganization of the terrace systems but then certain periods in which there are real peaks where there's really kind of intensified construction. I mean, I suppose you might, the end of the Middle Ages, we've got a lot less terrace construction than we have in the period, the couple of hundred years before. And you could say, oh, well, that's because there's a contraction in agriculture in the very late medieval period, or it might just be because they've got so many terraces by that point they don't need any more new ones. But then, you know, there are other ones being constructed in the 16th and 17th century, which is in a way counterintuitive, because that's not a time we would necessarily expect that to be taking place.
Thank you.
I still had a question that is more related to the sampling. In sites where you have limited invasive possibilities for sampling, could you use coring samples for dating, or is that practically just impossible because the soil gets too much disturbed?
Normally the problem is there's loads of rocks in it, so you can't get your sampling. But Tim, did you want to?
Yeah, in other applications you can. So I'm looking at marine cores from Dogger Bank at the moment. So yeah, there's no restrictions to sampling from cores.
Oh yeah, okay. Interesting, thank you.
Apart from rocks getting in the way.
Yeah.
Just need a bigger core.
That's going to make a real mess.
Hi again. Thanks again, Sam and Tim, for that great talk. 2 questions. One maybe more aimed at Tim is whether the characteristics of the soil, apart from the rocks you find in it, ever caused any issues, whether they always contained enough quartz, and whether that quartz was always sensitive enough to do the measurements on.
Yep, so answer that now, or are you going to ask the second question?
Go ahead.
Okay. Yeah, so the big limitation with luminescence dating is how much daylight exposure it had at the deposition. So there will be some earth banks where they've just dug the earth and turfed it up and it hasn't seen any daylight, and I just can't do that with my technique. There's no way around that. So there needs to be a mechanism by which you reset your OSL signals.
But I was thinking specifically about the Mediterranean type of soil that you get there.
Well, yeah, so quartz is pretty resistant to weathering and pretty ubiquitous. So you find that even on the carbonate islands.
Yeah.
Yeah, it's blown there from Sahara. So most of the time there is quartz present and you can date it. Yeah.
Good.
Every now and again we turn up in a field somewhere and Tim sucks his teeth and says, oh, it's all limestone here. Well, you're not going to get any results from this. For example, in the Taurus Mountains, and then usually about 15 minutes later, he says, oh, actually, we do seem to have, must have come from Cyprus or must have come from the Sahara.
And then a second question I had, maybe more aimed at you, Sam, is you talked about historic landscape characterization, and I was wondering whether there were instances where you could relate a specific typology to a specific age.
Good question. I mean, broadly speaking, yes, within local case study areas. So, for example, like the example on Naxos, or maybe some of the ones in Turkey. I think what to try and understand that better, we need a kind of a really large number of terraces within a particular system to try and understand, because I would say yes, we can do that to an extent, but I think to make it really robust, we need some good examples where we've got sort of 10, 15, 20 terraces within a system studied, and they're all the same data, or they're all similar dates, at which point we can probably say, look, in this area if we got terrace system that looks like this, the very high probability is it's going to be late medieval in date, or it's going to be late antique in date. I mean, I think there's some great candidates for that in the planned work in, for example, in Catalonia and in other of our case studies. so far, I mean, yeah, there are some trends, but what's really surprised us is that so many of these terraces seem to be late medieval in date. So in a way, we were expecting more variety in the dates, but so the fact that they were all fairly consistent was a bit of a surprise. Yeah. But for example, in the around Samos in Galicia, the vast majority of those are from the 17th century. You can just see by looking at them that they're all the same as each other.
Mm-hmm. I was also maybe just one more question, wondering about that late medieval intensification and whether you can find any explanation for that in terms of environmental or specific socioeconomic conditions.
Yes, I mean that is a very kind of that's a very sort of sensible question, and I mean so far the answer is not really. One of the things that we have, you know, we obviously thinking about this, one of the things we were looking at was, for example, climate proxies across that region. So we might, you know, we can see that we might think that both of the peaks in construction of terraces might coincide with particular types of climatic conditions, for example. But at the two ends of the Mediterranean, rainfall patterns, for example, were not the same during those two periods, and the kind of climate conditions were not the same. So I think, I mean, we don't have a single simple explanation for why we've got those trends currently. There may be various coincidences in our case studies, which mean that there are similar kinds of conditions in terms of land tenure or lordship or the control of land or the ability of peasants to start building terrace systems within on their land, on their farms. So, you know, in all of those areas, there may have been particularly sort of high levels of agency amongst the peasantry at those periods. But actually, I don't really have an answer for your question yet. That's another question which remains to be explored through the future work, I think.
Right. Thank you.
I don't know if anyone else has any more questions, or if there's anything anyone would like to add. And I guess it looks like we're getting to the end of our seminar. And then I would just like to thank you again, Sam and Tim, for coming in and giving this exciting talk. And thanks to all the participants for coming in as well.
Thanks very much to everybody for coming and listening, and thanks for inviting us.
Thank you very much.
Thank you.